March 1941. RAF pilots weren't being outflown. They were being betrayed. One dive, 1 second of negative G, and the engine went silent. German Bf-109s escaped or turned back to kill. The RAF knew the flaw, but the fix was years away. The pilots didn't have years. Then, this story stopped being about pilots and became about one woman. No new aircraft, no new engine. Just a 50-cent metal washer installed in secret. The next dive didn't stall. It fired back. That tiny piece of metal didn't just fix an engine. It saved 2,100 lives and changed the air war forever. March 14th, 1941, 7:42 a.m. At RAF Kenley, Beatrice Schilling stood on the cold tarmac, watching a Hurricane pilot prepare for a mission he might not survive. She was 32, a senior engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and painfully aware that the problem of killing RAF pilots still had no approved fix. That week alone, the Luftwaffe had pushed more than 40 Bf-109 fighters across the Channel. British squadrons met them again and again, nearly 30 engagements in just days. The losses told the story. 14 Hurricanes destroyed, 9 Spitfires gone. Every report pointed to the same failure, repeating with lethal consistency. The pattern in combat was brutally simple. A British pilot spotted a German fighter and pushed into a diving attack. The moment gravity went negative, the engine stumbled, then died. The German aircraft slipped away, or worse, turned back and opened fire on a helpless Hurricane as the pilot fought to restart his Rolls-Royce Merlin. Beatrice Schilling knew this story by heart. She'd studied the combat reports, combed through maintenance records, and spoken with the men who barely survived. The cause wasn't enemy fire. It was fuel flooding the carburetor under negative G forces. Basic physics with deadly results. Whenever a Spitfire or Hurricane snapped into a steep dive, fuel surged upward inside the carburetor's float chamber. The fuel jet starved. Power vanished. For roughly 1.5 seconds, the engine went dead, and that brief silence was lethal. In that time, a Bf-109 could close hundreds of yards and fire. German pilots never faced this risk. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection, eliminating float chambers entirely. They could dive, climb, roll, even fly inverted without losing power. The advantage was absolute. RAF pilots recognized it immediately. German pilots exploited it ruthlessly. Squadron commanders reported it again and again. The cost was mounting fast. The Royal Air Force was losing seasoned pilots faster than training units could replace them. Beatrice Schilling had already spent nearly a year attacking the problem from every angle. At Rolls-Royce, engineers were working toward a true fix, a pressure carburetor that would eliminate the flaw entirely. But it meant redesigning the entire fuel system. And that took time the RAF didn't have. Best estimates pushed delivery to 1943, possibly later. The war is happening now, and the men climbing into cockpits couldn't afford to wait. The Royal Air Force was hemorrhaging experienced pilots, faster than training schools could ever replace them. Beatrice Schilling had poured 11 months into solving the deadly engine problem. Rolls-Royce engineers were working on the ultimate solution, a pressure carburetor, a complete overhaul of the fuel system. But it wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe even 1944. The war, however, wouldn't pause, and the pilots in the skies that very morning couldn't afford to wait another second. Every morning, young pilots climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes, fully aware that their own engines could fail before enemy fire ever reached them. Squadron leader Davies strode past Beatrice Schilling toward his Hurricane. Just 24 years old, he had flown 41 combat missions and scored 3 confirmed kills. Twice in the past month, his engine had failed during dives, and he survived only through luck and countless hours of training. He gave Schilling a brief nod. She returned it with quiet resolve, knowing the stakes were higher than ever. Davies had no idea who she really was, the carburetor specialist from Farnborough. Most likely, he assumed she was just another secretary on the base. That morning at Kenley, Schilling carried a tiny brass component in her satchel. Precise, deceptively simple, and engineered with meticulous care. Her team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had spent 6 weeks testing it on bench engines. It worked flawlessly in controlled conditions. But the real test, the true measure of success, would come at 300 miles per hour in the chaos of combat. Combat wasn't just flying, it was a battle against gravity itself. Negative G-forces pinned pilots against their harnesses, and one mistake could mean death in a heartbeat. Just 1.5 seconds could decide life or death. Schilling strode to her Norton motorcycle, her leather satchel carrying the brass restrictor, and a plan that could either save the Royal Air Force or end her career at Farnborough. By noon, she would know which. The carburetor flaw had emerged months earlier, in July 1940, when the RAF switched to 100-octane fuel. Higher octane brought more boost, 1,310 horsepower from the Merlin engine, up from 1,100, but also intensified the deadly vulnerability. The Spitfire Mark II could reach 370 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to challenge any Bf-109. Yet the Skinner's Union carburetor couldn't cope with the negative G-forces unleashed during high-speed combat maneuvers. Schilling, however, understood carburetors better than anyone at Farnborough. She had joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, just 1 month after Britain declared war. Among the engine department, she was one of only 2 women, the other merely a secretary. Her presence was underestimated, but her expertise was about to prove indispensable. Schilling held the role of principal technical officer, overseeing carburetor research and development. Most of the men around her had never worked alongside a female engineer, and some doubted that women belonged in the field at all. She didn't care. Her focus was singular: keeping pilots alive. Engines had been her lifelong passion. At just 14, she bought her first motorcycle, a Norton, and dismantled its 2-stroke engine down to every last component. She studied each part until she understood exactly how it worked, then rebuilt it with precision. That early mastery would now save lives in ways few could imagine. By the age of 25, Schilling had raced that same Norton to an average speed of 106 miles per hour at Brooklands, fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star, an honor achieved by only 3 women in history. She was the second. Racing taught her more than speed. It taught her how engines failed under extreme stress, sharp turns, sudden acceleration, impossible lean angles. She learned to anticipate an engine's needs before the gauges could even react. That instinct made her Britain's foremost carburetor specialist. And now, pilots were dying because their engines couldn't withstand combat forces. The solution came to her in January, grounded in nothing more than simple physics. The problem was clear. Fuel flooded the float chamber whenever gravity reversed during a dive. Schilling asked herself a simple question. What if the flow could be restricted? Not entirely, just enough to stop the flooding. The engine would still receive fuel, but never too much. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. A brass disc with a precisely drilled hole at the center, fitted directly into the fuel line before the carburetor. The flow would be capped at just below full throttle demand. She machined the first prototype herself, a small brass thimble, 0.125 inches in diameter, perfectly engineered for the task. The hole at the center measured just 0.04 inches, and every fraction mattered. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood. Too small, and the engine would starve at full throttle. Schilling experimented with 17 different sizes before she found the perfect fit. Then she simplified the design further. A flat washer. Easier to manufacture, easier to install, and easy to replace if damaged. Bench tests were promising. The restrictor prevented flooding under simulated -G conditions. But bench tests were nothing like the chaos of combat. To know if it truly worked, she needed it in the air. Permission was a near impossible hurdle. Any unauthorized modification on an RAF fighter violated dozens of regulations. If the restrictor failed and a pilot died, Schilling could face court-martial, or worse. She made a decision. Test first, explain later. That morning at Kenley, Schilling carried 6 restrictors in her satchel and had one willing accomplice, Sergeant William Cooper, a veteran of 3 years working on Merlin engines. He had witnessed 19 pilots lost to engine failures. When Schilling revealed the tiny brass washer, he didn't ask a single question. He simply nodded and grabbed his toolkit. The Hurricane sat ready on the dispersal pad, the pilot inside, running through pre-flight checks, the engine warming. 20 minutes remained until takeoff. Cooper moved quickly, methodically, every second counting against them. Cooper quickly disconnected the fuel line between the pump and the carburetor. The brass restrictor slid smoothly into place. Then he secured it with a small butane torch. 60 seconds of work, precise and silent. The modification was invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Schilling inspected the weld. Clean, solid, flawless. Squadron Leader Davies would be flying with the restrictor installed, completely unaware. She hadn't informed him, the squadron commander, or anyone else. Only Cooper knew. Every second now carried the weight of risk. Every decision could mean life or death. If the restrictor failed and Davies didn't make it, there would be no paper trail, no authorization, no testing records, just a dead pilot and a tiny brass washer that shouldn't have existed. The Hurricane's Merlin engine thundered to full power. Davies ran through his pre-flight checks. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature normal, magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes. The Hurricane surged forward, accelerated down the runway, and lifted into the sky, every second carrying the weight of Shilling's gamble. Schilling watched as the Hurricane climbed steadily. 800 feet, 1,200, 2,000. The aircraft banked south, heading toward the channel. She held a pair of binoculars, tracking Davies as he climbed to 15,000 feet. Two more Hurricanes joined, forming a standard three-plane patrol. They headed toward Dungeness, where German fighters had been active all week. If Davies encountered a Bf-109, the dive would reveal whether her brass restrictor worked or failed. Schilling stayed silent on the tarmac, Cooper standing quietly beside her. Neither spoke. The weight of the moment hung in the morning air. The ground crew readied two more Hurricanes for the afternoon patrol. A fuel truck rumbled by. Mechanics shouted technical jargon across the dispersal area, the ordinary chaos of a wartime airfield. But Schilling heard none of it. Her mind was consumed with calculations. 0.04-inch hole, maximum fuel flow at full throttle, negative G duration of 1.5 seconds. The math was flawless, but numbers didn't fight battles. 40 minutes passed. An hour. Radio silence from Davies' section. It could mean anything. No enemy contact. Intense combat, leaving no time to report. Or Davies' Hurricane, strewn across a French field. At 9:37, the radio crackled to life. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Schilling lifted her binoculars and saw them. 3 dark shapes cutting through the morning sky. All 3 aircraft had returned. The Hurricanes entered the circuit. Davies touched down first, taxied to dispersal, cut the engine, and climbed out. Schilling's hands shook. She had designed bombs before, tested engine modifications in labs, but never anything like this. Never had she sent an unauthorized modification into combat. Davies removed his helmet, smiling, an unusual sight for a pilot fresh from a patrol. Normally, they looked haunted, exhausted. Cooper asked quietly, "Any issues with the engine, sir?" Davies looked from Cooper to Schilling, then back again. "Best the Merlin has ever run," he said, eyes alight. He had dived on 2 Messerschmitts over Dungeness, and the engine hadn't faltered for a single heartbeat. Schilling pressed him for details. At 14,000 feet, he spotted 2 Bf-109s heading east toward France. Davies positioned his section above them, seizing the altitude advantage. Then he plunged into a steep 400-mile-per-hour dive, negative G-forces pressing him hard against his harness. Every second was a test, and the Merlin held steady. The dive that should have starved the Merlin didn't. Full power, sustained through the entire descent. Davies closed to just 200 yards before the German pilot even realized he was there. He fired a precise 3-second burst, scoring hits on the left Messerschmitt's wing. The enemy fighter veered sharply and fled toward France. Pulling up, Davies regained altitude, the engine performing flawlessly throughout. For the first time in 11 months, he had executed a diving attack without the Merlin faltering. He wanted to know what had changed in his Hurricane. Schilling told him the tiny brass restrictor had just rewritten the rules of engagement. Schilling explained the restrictor, the tiny brass washer, and its role in controlling fuel flow. Davies stared at her for a long, tense moment. Then he turned to Cooper. Install that on every Hurricane at this station, today. Schilling reminded him it wasn't authorized. He didn't care. What mattered was keeping pilots alive. Every pilot at Kenley had lost friends to engine failures, 19 in 6 months. If the brass wanted to court-martial him for installing an unapproved modification, Davies said they could do it after the war. Right now, lives came first. Right away, Davies' squadron needed reliable engines. That afternoon, Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes. Schilling had brought 6. She kept 1 for testing. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with the restrictors. 0 engine failures. 12 diving attacks were executed successfully against German fighters. Pilots reported that the Merlin engines ran flawlessly. Some even claimed they felt more power at altitude than ever before. Word traveled fast. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about Schilling's invention. They wanted it, all of them, immediately. In just 2 days, Schilling's phone rang 14 times. Could she visit other stations? Could she bring more restricto? How quickly could they be produced? The bottleneck was supply. She had machined 6 herself in the RAE workshop, but producing thousands required full-scale facilities, brass stock, precision machining, and strict quality control. She needed Air Ministry approval, funding, and time. 4 days later, approval came. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her plan, calling it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the contract and ramped up production. Churning out 500 restrictors per week, installation began immediately across every fighter station in Britain. Schilling assembled a small, elite team, 3 engineers from Farnborough and 2 civilian mechanics. They would travel to RAF stations, personally overseeing each installation. The restrictor could be fitted without grounding the aircraft, a critical advantage. Every Hurricane and Spitfire remained fully operational. While the Battle of Britain had officially ended, German fighters continued to cross the Channel daily. Schilling's invention ensured that British pilots now had the edge they desperately needed. RAF Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons. Schilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and spare restrictors. Before the war, she had visited 43 RAF stations and knew every fighter base in southern England. The commanding officers, the ground crews, every detail. Now she was returning, armed with a tiny brass washer that would save the lives of countless pilots. Every base she reached, every engine she modified, turned the tide in Britain's favor, one restrictor at a time. By March 25th, the installation teams were ready. 600 restrictors had been manufactured. 40 stations were on the schedule, and 3,000 Merlin engines awaited modification. Shilling fired up her Norton and rode north toward Biggin Hill, the busiest fighter station in 11 Group. 32 Spitfires, 21 Hurricanes, and 4 squadrons rotated through continuous combat operations. She arrived at 0800 on March 26th, where Group Captain Grace met her at the gate. He had lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the past 2 months and insisted the restrictors be installed immediately. The ground crews worked in shifts, modifying 4 aircraft at a time. Each installation took 12 minutes. Disconnect the fuel line, weld the restrictor into place, reconnect, and test for leaks. The welding had to be flawless. A single faulty joint at altitude could starve the engine completely. Shilling personally supervised every installation, inspecting each weld, testing every connection, and rejecting 3 restrictors that didn't meet her exacting standards. Pilots watched intently. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, with 41 combat missions under his belt, had experienced engine failure twice, both at critical moments during dogfights. Now, every pilot knew the stakes had just shifted. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey asked Shilling how a simple washer could solve such a complex carburetor problem. She explained the physics of fuel flow, float chamber behavior, and the effects of -G on liquid fuel. Lacey, an engineering graduate from Cambridge, understood immediately and called it brilliant simplicity. By March 28, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had restrictors installed. Shilling then moved on to Hornchurch, North Weald, and Tangmere, repeating the process at every station. Ground crews labored 12-hour shifts while pilots flew combat patrols with the modified engines. 0 failures were reported. The restrictor performed flawlessly, exactly as designed. Pilots began calling it Miss Shilling's Orifice. The nickname came from Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce's supercharger division. A bit of crude British humor, slightly irreverent. Shilling didn't mind. After 6 years working alongside RAF personnel, she understood how military men handled stress. If a cheeky nickname helped them remember the critical modification, she would accept it without complaint. And indeed, the nickname spread even faster than the restrictor itself, becoming a part of RAF lore almost overnight. By April, every pilot and every fighter command knew about Miss Shilling's Orifice. They requested it specifically, and some pilots refused to fly combat missions without the modification installed. Squadron commanders backed them. They had seen too many skilled pilots lost to preventable engine failures. Even German intelligence took notice. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April highlighted the improved effectiveness of RAF diving attacks, a subtle but decisive edge born from one woman's ingenuity. British fighters no longer faltered during -G maneuvers. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage had vanished. By mid-April, Shilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines, every Hurricane, every Spitfire, every operational fighter command, every training unit, and every aircraft in reserve. The modification became standard equipment. New aircraft rolling off the production lines at Castle Bromwich and Southampton came with restrictors already installed. Meanwhile, the pressure carburetor was still under development, but the RAF no longer had to wait for a long-term solution. Rolls-Royce estimated that the pressure carburetor would be ready for production in 1943. Yet the restrictor performed so flawlessly that some engineers questioned whether a full redesign was even necessary. Why rebuild the entire fuel system when a simple 50-cent brass washer solved the problem? Shilling understood. The restrictor was a stopgap, brilliant, life-saving, but temporary. The pressure carburetor would eventually eliminate the negative G issue entirely. No fuel flow restrictions, no power limitations, and full engine performance under every flight condition. That was the true engineering solution. But in the meantime, the RAF owed its pilot's survival to one ingenious woman and her tiny brass invention. But until 1943, Miss Shilling's Orifice kept RAF pilots alive, and that was enough. The results were undeniable. Fighter Command tracked every engagement, every kill, every loss, and the statistics told a clear story. In March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF fighters experienced engine failures in 38% of diving attacks against German aircraft. Pilots were forced to break off pursuits. Enemy fighters escaped, or worse, German pilots noticed the vulnerability and exploited it relentlessly. The numbers were stark, and the risk to every pilot was very real. German pilots had deliberately lured British fighters into diving attacks, confident that Merlin engines would fail. By April 1941, after the restrictor was installed, engine failures during dives dropped to just 0.4%, virtually non-existent. The rare failures that occurred were due to unrelated mechanical issues, battle damage, or normal combat attrition. The effect on combat performance was immediate. In March, Fighter Command had lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires while shooting down 61 German aircraft, a meager kill-to-loss ratio of 1.3 to 1. April told a different story. Only 29 British fighters were lost, while 94 German aircraft were destroyed, a decisive ratio of 3.2 to 1. The restrictor wasn't the only factor, but squadron commanders recognized it as a major contributor to improved performance. Pilots reported renewed confidence in combat. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, flying Spitfires out of Duxford, had suffered engine failures 4 times before the restrictor. After its installation, he dove into attacks without hesitation, destroying 3 Messerschmitts Bf-109s in May and 2 more in June. He credited the restrictor with giving him the confidence to commit fully to aggressive tactics. Soon, the modification's influence spread beyond Fighter Command, impacting every corner of the RAF. RAF Coastal Command requested restrictors for their bow fighters. Bomber Command wanted them for training aircraft. Even the Fleet Air Arm inquired about fitting them to carrier-based fighters. Shilling coordinated production with Rolls-Royce, and by June, the factory was producing 1,000 restrictors per week. The modification remained in active service throughout 1943, until Rolls-Royce finally introduced the pressure carburetor in January 1943. The new pressure carburetor finally eliminated the negative G problem entirely. Using fuel injection principles similar to German engines, it required no float chamber, no flooding, and delivered perfect fuel flow under any flight condition. However, converting existing aircraft was labor-intensive. The old carburetor had to be removed, new fuel pumps installed, and engine controls rewired, each conversion taking roughly 8 hours. During that time, the aircraft was grounded. Fighter Command couldn't afford to take squadrons out of action for extended maintenance, so the restrictors remained in use. Many planes flew with Miss Schilling's Orifice until 1944, and some continued using it until the end of the war. New production Spitfires and Hurricanes were equipped with pressure carburetors, but older aircraft continued to fly with the restrictors. Pilots trusted them. Ground crews knew how to maintain them. As the saying went, if it worked, don't change it. Shilling moved on to other critical projects, developing cold weather starting systems for engines in Iceland and Russia, researching high-altitude fuel mixture issues, and helping design improved supercharger systems for late-war Merlin variants. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her busy with dozens of technical challenges, yet the restrictor remained her most celebrated contribution. Pilots remembered it, and engineers studied it. After the war, aviation schools taught the restrictor as a prime example of elegant problem-solving under pressure, a simple solution implemented immediately with measurable results. Everything good engineering should embody. Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, reflected years later, "Beatrice Schilling helped us win World War II. Of that there is no doubt. The restrictor was a war-winning modification. Yet Schilling's contributions didn't end there. The Royal Aircraft Establishment continued to place critical challenges on her desk. Engine failures at high altitude, fuel system icing in extreme cold, starting problems in Arctic conditions. Every problem threatened pilots' lives, and every problem found a solution with Shilling. She tackled cold weather modifications for Spitfires deployed to Murmansk, where Russian winter temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard engine oil turned to sludge, batteries failed, and fuel lines froze, leaving British pilots unable to start their aircraft. Soviet ground crews were unfamiliar with Merlin engines. Shilling devised a cold start procedure using preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures, and it worked. Spitfires flew combat missions over Murmansk throughout the winter of 1941. She also addressed high-altitude performance issues. Late-war Spitfire variants operated at 35,000 feet, pushing the Merlin engine to its limits. Shilling's expertise kept these aircraft flying under extreme conditions. At extreme altitudes, thin air and low oxygen levels demanded precise fuel mixture calibration. Too rich, and the engine flooded. Too lean, and it overheated. Shilling developed altitude-compensating carburetor modifications that boosted power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Her personal life remained separate from her groundbreaking work. She had married George Naylor in September 1938, an aerodynamicist at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. When war broke out, He volunteered for RAF Bomber Command, leaving Schilling to focus entirely on solving the technical challenges that would keep British pilots alive. George Naylor flew Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron, completing 31 combat missions over Germany. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing an extra tour beyond his required missions. Schilling worried for him every time he took off, fully aware of Bomber Command's staggering loss rates. Nearly 1 in 2 crew members did not survive the war. Naylor defied those odds, returning safely to Farnborough in 1944. At home, they never discussed missions or projects. Work and marriage remained in separate compartments, a silent understanding between two brilliant minds, navigating the pressures of war. Schilling continued racing motorcycles whenever time allowed. She had paused her competitive racing at Brooklyn Circuit when the war began. The famous track had been converted into aircraft production facilities. Yet she still rode her Norton. High-speed riding helped her think, often solving problems that lab work alone could not. Some of her most innovative engineering ideas emerged while racing at 90 miles per hour along country roads. By 1945, she had contributed to 17 major projects at Farnborough, including cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, fuel mixture optimization, and supercharger efficiency upgrades. Each project Schilling tackled saved lives and kept RAF aircraft operational under extreme conditions. Yet none achieved the fame of the restrictor. The war ended in May 1945, with Germany's surrender, followed by Japan in August. The Royal Aircraft Establishment shifted from urgent wartime projects to peacetime research, with slower pace and different priorities. Schilling remained at Farnborough by choice. Engineering was her life. In 1948, she received official recognition for her wartime contributions, a testament to the countless pilots saved and the innovations that had kept Britain's skies defended. King George VI appointed her an Officer of the Order of the British Empire. The OBE ceremony at Buckingham Palace saw Schilling don her formal dress, accept the medal, pose for photographs, and return to work at Farnborough the very next morning. She never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, and never stopped proving that women belonged in technical fields. Her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment continued for another 21 years, yet the restrictor remained her enduring legacy. The simple brass washer that had saved countless RAF pilots and changed the course of the air war. Schilling remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, completing 33 years of continuous service. She never ascended to the top administrative roles, which were reserved for men under the RAF leadership structure, regardless of achievement. Schilling accepted these limitations, preferring hands-on engineering work instead. She thrived in laboratory testing, field modifications, and solving real-world problems with practical solutions. Her post-war projects included contributions to the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile, further cementing her reputation as a pioneering engineer who let results speak louder than titles. Schilling also focused on fuel delivery systems and high-altitude engine performance. She investigated the effects of wet runways on jet aircraft braking, as landing accidents had become a leading cause of pilot fatalities by the 1950s. Her research culminated in 3 published technical papers, offering practical solutions to improve safety. Beyond aviation, she even contributed to designing a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team, an unusual project for an aeronautical engineer, yet one that relied on her expertise in aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction management, honed over 3 decades of innovative engineering. The RAF team put Shilling's bobsled design to use in competition. They didn't win medals, but they completed every run without crashing. Shilling retired in 1969 at the age of 60. In retirement, she restored vintage motorcycles, occasionally racing at classic motorcycle events, and meticulously maintained her Norton, the very same machine she had raced at Brooklands in 1934. That motorcycle had taught her to understand engines under extreme stress, the skill that had guided her through decades of groundbreaking engineering work and life-saving innovations. On March 8, 2019, the mayor of Waterville unveiled a commemorative plaque at the local library, marking 110 years since Shilling's birth. Her restrictor had become more than a wartime innovation. It became a teaching example. Engineering schools around the world studied it, a simple solution to a complex problem, implemented under immense pressure, with measurable, life-saving results. Original brass washers are displayed in some university collections, silent reminders that elegance and impact in engineering do not require complexity. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Tales of engineers who saved lives through ingenuity and determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Texas, Germany, Japan, the United States. Our community stretches across the globe. You're not just a viewer, you're helping preserve history. Let us know if someone in your family served. Thank you for watching and for keeping Beatrice Schilling's legacy alive.